Welcome to Discourse, where we cut through the noise and make sense of the chaos. I'm your host, Wayne Unger. I'm a law professor and former Silicon Valley nerd, and I've spent years breaking down complex topics into digestible takeaways. And on this podcast, we'll take a deep dive into the pressing issues shaping our world in law, politics, technology, business, and more. No echo chambers, no corporate influence, just thoughtful analysis and respectful civic dialogue. Because understanding different perspectives isn't just important, it's necessary. Let's get started. All right, welcome back to Discourse. I'm your host, Wayne Unger, and we are recording today's episode at 3 p.m. on Thursday, November 20th, 2025. And as always, things may have changed since. On today's episode, we're discussing two major topics. Now, of course, there's always more to discuss in today's world, especially under a Trump administration, but we're going to focus on these two. So first, the federal government has finally reopened after the longest government shutdown in American history. And we need to talk about what Republicans slipped into the bill that ended the government shutdown, specifically Section 213, which is one of the most brazen examples of legislative self-dealing that I've seen. Republican senators literally created a pathway to collect $500,000, $500,000 from the United States Treasury, taxpayer funds, and they buried it in must-pass legislation. A bipartisan coalition of House representatives have introduced a bill to repeal it, but for now, Section 213 remains operative and enforceable. And again, that pathway to Senate Republicans collecting $500,000 remains open. Second, we're going to discuss something that isn't getting enough attention, I don't think, at least, and that's the discussion regarding this AI bubble that's forming right now. Well, I believe many AI-driven startups will go bust in the coming years, and many will come and go. But the companies that power the AI infrastructure, the compute that's necessary, like Nvidia, well, they'll continue to thrive. It's a classic gold rush dynamic. Many prospects will go broke, but the people selling the picks and the shovels, so to speak, will make the fortunes. Let's begin with some context. After 35 plus days, the federal government has reopened. This shutdown officially became the longest in American history, surpassing that 35-day shutdown from December 2018 to January 2019 during Trump's first term. The previous shutdown was about border wall funding, though it was really about Trump's ego and his campaign promise, in my view. This shutdown, of course, centered on different demands as Democrats wanted to renew the Affordable Care Act subsidies, those provisions. And that did not quite happen in the bill that reopened the government, but the promises were made. Promises were made that the Congress will consider the renewal of those subsidies before the end of the year. We'll see whether that actually happens. Now, during the shutdown, federal employees went without paychecks for nearly 2 months. Essential services were disrupted. National parks were closed or operating with skeleton crews. Scientific research was delayed by government agencies. Contract workers who don't get back pay like federal employees do, well, they lost the income that they'll probably never recover. And while all of this was happening, while the federal workers were lining up at food banks and struggling to pay their mortgages, Republican senators were busy writing themselves a check, or at least creating a pathway for a check from the United States Treasury, from taxpayer dollars. So let me explain. Buried in the bill that reopened the government, Section 213 specifically, is a provision that creates a private right of action, allowing certain Republican senators to sue the Justice Department for up to $500,000 in statutory damages. And this isn't mere speculation. This is an interpretation. It's right there in the text, like it's clear as day. To understand why this is so egregious, we need to go back to the special counsel, Jack Smith's investigation of January 6th, the insurrection, the attack on the United States Capitol. Well, during Jack Smith's investigation, prosecutors issued grand jury subpoenas pursuant to something called the Stored Communications Act for the cell phone records belonging to several Republican senators and one House member, if I remember correctly. Now, these were not fishing expeditions. Prosecutors likely had reason to believe that the records could inform their investigation regarding efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And Judge James Boasberg authorized the subpoenas, and in fact, he went so far as imposing a non-disclosure order pursuant to 18 USC section 2705B. Now, these non disclosure orders prevented cell phone service providers from providing any notice to the senators. And these non disclosure orders are not uncommon. In fact, they're protective measures written and permissible by the law in government investigations designed to prevent evidence destruction, witness intimidation, or actions that could seriously jeopardize an investigation. Now, the legal standard for issuing such orders is well established, and Judge Brosberg, respected federal judge, determined that that standard was met. Now, Republican senators who, of course, are upset that their privacy was violated, that their cell phone records were produced pursuant to a federal investigation, well, they were subject to the subpoenas, but they did not receive the subpoenas themselves. Now, they argue that they were entitled to legal notice that these subpoenas were issued and received by their cell phone service providers. And the Republican senators whose records were subpoenaed claimed that this violated their rights under a different statute, 2 USC section 6628. Now, the Republican senators say that this statute, section 6628, entitled them to notice that their cell phone records had been subpoenaed, but that's not quite my read of the statute. Here's where it gets technical, and stay with me because this matters. Under 2 USC section 6628, subsection C, no other law can bar a service provider or a Senate office from providing notice to the Senate of a subpoena that seeks to obtain Senate data. But look at that language clearly. 2 USC section 6628 says no other law can prohibit a service provider to notifying the Senate that a subpoena has been issued that seeks Senate data. But in order for that to really play, there needs to be some sort of law that entitles you to notice, right? That in or mandates or obligates the service provider to send you notice. Now, this statutory notification provision under 2 USC section 6628 was enacted to protect legislative privilege. So it does have a legitimate purpose. And on its face, it appears to supersede Judge Brosberg's non-disclosure order, except, and this is the crucial part, a cell phone service provider is not statutorily required to provide notice to the Senate under the same provision in the Stored Communications Act that permitted the grand jury subpoenas in the first place. By my reading of the law, the cell phone service providers had no legal duty to disclose that they received the subpoenas. Thus, the Republican senators were not, in fact, entitled to notice from the cell phone service providers. Their rights were not violated because they did not have a legal right to notice. And the statute that they point to, that they say entitles them to legal notice, 2 USC section 6628, doesn't actually entitle them to notice. It just says no other law can bar them from receiving notice. Now, I acknowledge there's a genuine legal ambiguity here. Reasonable minds might read these statutes differently. Some legal scholars might conclude that the senators did have a legal right to notice, but that's not my read of the statute. Others might disagree, and that's why we have courts, to be fair, to resolve these kinds of statutory interpretation ambiguities, these questions. But that's where Section 213 becomes something much darker than a legal dispute about statutory interpretation and potentially conflicting statutes. Rather than letting courts resolve the legal ambiguity, rather than closing the loophole through normal legislative processes with hearings and debates and public scrutiny, these Republican senators did something, in my view, that was absolutely breathtaking, and not in a good way. They wrote a new law. They added it to a must-pass legislation to reopen the federal government. And they wrote that new law to retroactively create a legal duty requiring the service providers to disclose the grand jury subpoenas. Now, they made this duty retroactive to cover the Jack Smith investigation. And then, this is the breathtaking part, they created what's called a private right of action. In other words, an ability for them to sue, allowing themselves to sue the Justice Department for violating this newly created but retroactively applicable duty. And for each violation of that duty, they entitled themselves to $500,000 in statutory damages. So let that sink in for a moment. During a government shutdown, when you had countless Americans and federal employees and even members of the military lining up to collect food from a food bank to put food on their table to feed their children, Republican senators created a legal duty that did not exist at the time of an investigation. They made it retroactive and they gave themselves the power to sue for violating this newly created duty that they made retroactive. And they set the damages at $500,000 per violation. Now, this is self dealing, in my view. This is corruption, in my view. This is legislators using their legislative power to write themselves checks from the United States Treasury to take money from the taxpayers. But it gets worse. Section 213's language is deliberately vague about who receives the damages. I ask, will the money that they collect, will it flow to the senators in their official capacity, deposited into official Senate accounts subject to ethics, rules, and public oversight? Or will it land in their personal bank accounts, a $500,000 windfall courtesy of the legislative pen, courtesy of, in my view, a blatant abuse of power? This legislative text, Section 213, well, it doesn't specify. And that ambiguity is, in my view, intentional because why not, in their view? We likely won't get a judicial answer to this question because once the senators assert their claims, and they'll likely do so quickly if they haven't already done so, in the form of a demand letter sent to the Justice Department, well, given Trump's control, his heavy hand over the Justice Department, I would say expect rapid settlements because Trump will pressure or order his Justice Department to settle these quickly. And it's likely no complaint, no lawsuit will actually be filed in federal court. It will just be a formal demand submitted to the Justice Department. And it will be a quiet negotiation in which Trump pressures his Justice Department to move forward with the settlement. And that settlement will likely include a confidentiality clause barring anyone from talking about it because, well, it's normal for settlement agreements to have confidentiality provisions. Because of this process, no judge will scrutinize where the money goes. No court will determine whether the demands go into, say, official Senate accounts or personal bank accounts. And no judicial opinion will establish precedent or provide guidance for future cases. Now, Congress routinely enacts laws creating liability for future conduct. I mean, that's completely normal. That's appropriate, of course. That's how the legislative process is supposed to work. But Section 213 reaches backwards to create a lucrative cause of action for something that happened in the past. And the amendment transforms a debatable statutory violation, something that courts might have concluded wasn't a violation at all. It transforms it into a jackpot payable by the taxpayers to the very legislatures who wrote the ticket. If these senators genuinely believed that prosecutors violated Section 6628, Section 6628, well, they had other options. They could have convened Senate investigations into the Justice Department's practices. They could have conducted public oversight hearings. They could have passed clarifying legislation for future cases, which in part Section 213 does. Instead, they created a new remedy calibrated precisely to their situation and quietly inserted it into must pass legislation during a government shutdown where the pressure to reopen the government was enormous and the public's attention was divided. Of course, the public celebrated the reopening of the government. I have as well. And because we did, this Section 213 was allowed to slip through. Now, the founders of the United States, they designed the Senate to be a chamber of sober second thought, of something that's insulated from popular passion by longer terms and smaller size. It was part of that compromise. They trusted senators with unique powers, advice and consent, treaty ratification, impeachment trials, precisely because The senators were expected to exercise judgment beyond narrow self interest. But Section 213 betrays that trust, in my view. It's legislation acting as personal enrichment, it's lawmaking as scorekeeping, and it represents exactly the kind of corruption that erodes public faith in democratic institutions. In my view, it's a shame. Now, there is some good news here that I must report. A bipartisan coalition of House representatives have introduced legislation to repeal Section 213. Representatives Jamie Raskin, a Democrat from Maryland, and Thomas Massey, a Republican from Kentucky, are leading the effort along with countless others. And they've been joined by members from both parties who recognize that Section 213 sets a dangerous precedent and that it's, in its purest of forms, corruption. Representative Raskin said in a statement, quote, Congress should not be in the business of writing retrospective get out of jail free cards for its own members. Section 213 is an embarrassment to the institution and an insult to taxpayers. And I agree with him. Representative Massey, a libertarian leaning Republican who frequently breaks with his party, case in point, the Epstein files, well, he was even more blunt. He said, This is corruption, plain and simple. I don't care what party you're from. If you vote to give yourself $500,000 from the United States Treasury, you're corrupt. I agree with him as well. The repeal legislation has attracted co sponsors from both parties, which is encouraging. So I think if it goes to a floor vote in the United States House, that it has enough votes to pass by that simple majority. But the Senate needs to pass it as well. And that's where things get complicated. The very senators who inserted Section 213 into the shutdown bill would need to vote to repeal it. And given that they stand to personally benefit from Section 213 remaining in effect, I'm skeptical that they'll do the right thing here. Now, that those senators, I believe there are 8 of them, if I remember correctly. And so it is possible mathematically for all of the Republicans minus those 8 to join all of the Democrats to repeal this. It is possible, but I would say it's unlikely in today's era. So for now, Section 213 remains operative. The Republican senators who inserted Section 213 into the bill can proceed with their claims against the Justice Department. And unless the repeal effort succeeds, they'll likely collect their $500,000 payouts with minimal public scrutiny. But the thing here is, because it is operative today and a repeal has not yet happened, if it happens at all, it is certainly possible that the Republican senators have already asserted their claims against the Justice Department. And it's certainly possible that those same Republican senators have already settled or will settle in the coming days with the Justice Department for that check. Now, this isn't just about money. The money, of course, is certainly offensive enough. This is also about what Section 213 represents. It's the governing class that views public office as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than public service. It's about a political culture where legislators feel entitled to use their lawmaking power to benefit themselves financially. It's about a system where corruption has become so normalized that senators can insert provisions like Section 213 into must pass legislation without expecting any significant consequences. At the very least, they should be held accountable at the ballot box. If we're serious about combating corruption, if we're serious about restoring public faith in government and governmental institutions, if we're serious about the principle that no one, not even United States senators, should be able to use their official position for personal financial gain, then Section 213 must be repealed. And it should not just be repealed, the repeal should add language mandating that the senators who might have gained from this windfall release records if they actually benefited from the windfall. I urge every listener to contact their representatives in the House and the Senate and tell them to support the repeal effort because this isn't a partisan issue. Republicans would be upset if the Democrats tried this, and Democrats are certainly upset that the Republicans have tried this. This is a bipartisan issue. This is actually, in fact, a nonpartisan issue. It is corruption. It is about basic governmental ethics and the integrity of our democratic institutions. I think we can all agree, no matter where we fall on the political spectrum, that it is unethical for legislators to write themselves a pathway to $500,000 to pocket that money. And who pays for it? We do as taxpayers. Now, let's shift gears and talk about something completely different, but also equally important in my view. And that's artificial intelligence. So I'm going to deviate a bit from our normal MO about politics. And as I mentioned at the top of every episode, this is also a show about tech and business. So let's talk about those things. Many say we're in the midst of an AI gold rush. Venture capital firms are throwing billions of dollars at anything with the word AI in its pitch deck. Companies are rebranding themselves as AI powered to attract investment and to attract customers. Stock prices for AI related companies have skyrocketed if they're publicly traded, and everyone seems convinced that we are on the verge of an AI revolution that will transform every industry. I agree with that. AI has and will continue to transform every industry. Now, I'm not saying AI isn't transformative technology. It certainly is. And let me be very clear on that. Large language models, machine learning, computer vision, these are all real technological advances with real applications that can advance us as humans, advance the human condition. But here's what concerns me. We're seeing the same pattern that we saw during the dot-com bubble in the late 1990s and even the cryptocurrency bubble in 2021 or so. And let me explain what I mean. Right now, there are thousands of AI startups that are essentially wrappers around existing large language models. They're taking OpenAI's API or Anthropic's Claude and its API and building a user interface around it and calling themselves an AI company. They're raising millions or even billions in venture capital based on the promise that AI will revolutionize their particular niche, whatever that customer service, legal research, medical diagnosis, or content creation, whatever there is, what they're trying to produce. Many of these companies will go bust, though, not because AI isn't useful, but because they don't have sustainable business models and because statistics show that most startups fail. Now, they're paying OpenAI or Anthropic for their API success, marking up that cost and hoping that they can acquire enough customers to achieve profitability before their venture capital runs out. And now most won't make it. We're already seeing signs of this. Several high profile AI startups have quietly shut down in recent months, others have pivoted away from their original AI focus. Still, others are desperately trying to raise additional funding rounds at lower valuations than their previous rounds, what's known as a down round, which is often a precursor to failure, but not always. The problem is that building a thin layer on top of someone else's AI model, well, that doesn't create a defensible business necessarily. Your competitors can do the same thing. There's not much that's proprietary there. The company providing the underlying model can easily build your feature into their own product if they wanted to. But of course, that's dependent on their own business model and their own product strategy. Customers increasingly realize that they can just use ChatGPT or Claude directly rather than paying a premium for your specialized interface. That will continue to happen. But here's the crucial distinction. And this is where I think many investors and analysts are getting it wrong. While many AI driven startups will fail, the companies that power the AI infrastructure won't. And we don't have to look very far. Just think about Nvidia as an example. Leading up to yesterday's earnings announcement, I think it was yesterday. Yesterday's earning announcement, analysts were saying Nvidia would trade down because they would start to show signs of this AI bubble. Well, turns out Nvidia beat expectations. Their GPUs are essential for training and running large language models. They power the compute that's necessary for the AI to work. And every AI company needs NVIDIA chips or chips from a competitor to NVIDIA, but that can compute and can do the same thing. Every major tech company is buying Nvidia hardware. We see that in their sales data. We see that in their earnings report. The demand is so high, in fact, there's a global shortage of high end GPUs. Nvidia's stock price has reflected this reality. They're becoming one of the most valuable companies in the world because they're selling the picks and the shovels in this AI gold rush. They're selling what is necessary. This is the classic dynamic of every technological revolution. Think about during the California gold rush of 1849, most prospects didn't strike it rich. The many went bust, in fact. And you know who made the money? The people selling the picks, the shovels, the pans, the supplies. Levi Strauss made a fortune selling durable pants to the miners. Those became what we know as Levi jeans. Samuel Brannan became California's first millionaire by selling mining supplies, not by mining the gold himself. The same pattern played out during the dot-com bubble boom. Most dot-com startups failed spectacularly. Take pets.com as an example. Pets.com and other websites like Webvan and eToys, well, these companies raised hundreds of millions of dollars in capital, achieved sky high valuations, and then they collapsed. But the companies providing the underlying infrastructure, companies like Cisco, who I used to work for, as full transparency, Oracle and Microsoft, Apple even, those companies survived and they thrived because everyone needed their products regardless of what specific .com companies succeeded. The internet needed Cisco because Cisco was the pipes and the tubes to the internet. It what connects computers to each other. It is the backbone to the internet. And we're seeing the same pattern now with artificial intelligence. Nvidia is the obvious example, but of course there are others. Cloud computing providers like AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud are seeing massive growth because AI requires enormous compute power. Companies that provide data infrastructure, network infrastructure, and power infrastructure for data centers are all positioned to benefit regardless of which specific AI applications succeed. We see this in their earnings reports. We see Cisco, for example, succeed. Even companies creating foundation models, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, Meta, are likely to survive and thrive because they own the underlying technology that everyone else is building on top of. They're not dependent on any single application succeeding. They can pivot whenever and wherever, whatever use cases actually provide value. Think of it this way, right? Apple will continue to succeed because it has provided the tubes, the pipes, the infrastructure, the plumbing that allow other companies to function. Google, for example, is dependent on its app, and its app is distributed by Apple and Google, their app stores. The same thing is true there. But that AI powered customer service startup that raised $50 million last year, the one that's essentially a chatbot wrapper around ChatGPT 4, well, that company is in trouble. When their Series B funding runs out and they haven't achieved profitability, and when their investors realize that there's nothing really there, well, that's when we'll start to see the AI bubble start to pop. Now, you might be thinking, Wayne, aren't you being a little pessimistic here? And maybe these AI startups will find sustainable business models. Maybe they'll turn a profit. In fact, software in general has massive profit margins, and that's a good thing. That's why software, for example, is scalable. That's why software companies have massive valuations. But maybe the productivity gains from AI, maybe those will justify the current valuations and future valuations for that matter. It's certainly possible. But there's enough, I think, in economic history and enough in technological revolutions and that history to recognize that there are some warning signs here. And right now, the warning signs are flashing, I think. First, the amount of venture capital flowing into AI startups has far outpaced any reasonable assessment of near term revenue potential, even midterm revenue potential. Investors are betting on future growth that may not actually materialize, and so that money will vaporize. They're pricing in optimistic scenarios where AI replaces huge swaths of human labor, but they're not accounting for the regulatory, technical, and social barriers that replacement actually that is actually happening here. I think it's fair to acknowledge that while some say AI will replace humans, it's more so, in my view, and I think history has shown this, that it's not automation that replaces humans. It's humans with automation, those that have the skill set and the knowledge to power automation. Those humans replace the humans who do not have the knowledge about AI and about automation. Second, this is also another important point. Many AI startups are actually achieving growth by giving their product away for free or below cost. Say, maybe a freemium model. They're subsidizing user acquisition with venture capital, leading massive marketing campaigns, doing a tremendous amount of ad spend, hoping to achieve scale, and then they figure out monetization later. This is a classic lather, rinse, and repeat model. This is the classic .com playbook. And we know how that ended for most companies. Oftentimes, it is difficult for companies as they grow and scale to figure out their business models to turn a profit. You look at a company like Uber, Uber was eventually able to do it. Companies like Lyft were also able to do it. But how many other ride share startups came and went, and you don't even know their names? Third, there's a massive overcapacity in the AI startup ecosystem. There are dozens or even hundreds of companies trying to solve the same problem using the same underlying technology. So there needs to be some form of differentiation here. Most markets can't support that many competitors. Eventually, there'll be consolidation in the form of acquisitions, mergers, and bankruptcies that wields the field down to just a few winners. But that process will be painful for investors and employees of the losing companies. Meanwhile, the investors of the winning companies will they'll make a lot of money. And fourth, the cost structure doesn't make sense for many of the AI applications. Running large language models is expensive. API costs add up quickly. Now, the margins may be great, but the scale that's needed may hinder some growth here. Companies are discovering that the economics of AI are not as favorable as they may have initially thought, especially for applications that require real time responses or processing large volumes of data that are really intensive. So, what does this mean for the economy and for investors? Well, if I'm right about this potential AI bubble that is there but isn't there, I think we're going to see significant market correction at some point. And this isn't crazy to say. I think a lot of people are saying this, but it's not necessarily a crash. I don't think we're going to have a repeat of, say, the 2000s .com bubble, though that is possible. But we'll see things like a repricing of AI assets. We'll see down rounds as investors realize that many of these companies won't actually achieve growth that they promised, as they don't have sustainable business models, as they don't have market adoption of their products, right? They're trying to solve things that aren't actually necessary to solve. If you think back to the Internet of Things, where inanimate objects and devices were being connected to the internet, you may remember a company called Juicero. They created a juicing product that was connected to the internet, this kind of smart juicing product. You insert like this little capsule thing and it pumps out a juice. Well, of course, that is famously a failure. But the point here is they tried to solve a problem that really wasn't necessary. And I think that is what we're seeing with many of these AI startups. Now, the timing is uncertain. Bubbles can persist longer than rational analysis suggests that they should. And as some economists famously say, the market can remain irrational longer than it can remain solvent, but eventually reality catches up. So when the correction does come, when there's some sort of market adjustment, it will be painful for some. Employees of failing startup companies that are funded purely off venture capital and they can't turn a profit, well, they'll lose their jobs. Investors who bet heavily on AI will see portfolio losses. And that's inevitable. In a way, you can say that that's expected in this game. And there'll be broader ripple effects throughout the entire tech sector. Here's a dangerous point, though. We have, as a society, have recognized that there are some businesses that are too big to fail. You saw this, say, during the 2008 recession, where the United States federal government stepped in to save businesses from failing, whether they were the big automobile manufacturers or the big banks, as an example. Well, that may happen here. If ChatGPT and Anthropic's Claude AI power so much of the economy, so much of the artificial intelligence that powers the economy, there might be a day in which the federal government says you're too big to fail. And OpenAI has already begun to hint at this because OpenAI has publicly stated now that it wants to be effectively insured by the United States federal government. It wants to be insured by the United States federal government. I'll say that again. It wants to be saved by the taxpayers if something goes wrong. If they take a miscalculated bet, if they make the wrong strategic decisions, just like banks did, just like auditing firms did in 2008. That said, this is also important. This potential for a correction will also be healthy in the long run, though. It will separate the wheat from the the weak from the strong and the strong from the weak. It will redirect capital from unsustainable business models to genuinely valuable applications of AI that do solve actual problems and can generate cash to support investment and to support employees and to support costs. It will force companies to focus on profitability rather than just growth at any cost that won't translate into sustainable revenue streams. And crucially, the underlying technology that will continue to advance the AI revolution, well, that is real, even if many AI companies aren't built to last. The companies providing the infrastructure, companies like Cisco and Nvidia, the cloud providers such as Google and Oracle and Microsoft, the foundation model developers, well, they'll continue to benefit as AI becomes increasingly integrated into business processes and consumer applications. That is inevitable. So if you're an investor, my advice would be focus on the company selling the picks and the shovels rather than the prospects. But I am not a financial advisor. I am not a market analyst by any stretch of the imagination. So I am not giving you formal investment advice. That's just my thought. If you work in I would say think carefully about whether your company has a defensible business model or if you're just riding a wave of venture capital that will eventually recede. But even then, if you're an employee, you could come out very lucrative riding that wave if you time it correctly. So remember that technological revolutions are real and they're important, but that doesn't mean every company claiming to be a part of the revolution will succeed. We have seen this narrative over and over and over again. Eventually, this AI hype will die down. Whether it's now or 10 years or 50 years from now, it will. It will die down as AI continues to grow into the tentacles of all industries. That's ultimately a good thing. But keep in mind as you hear breathless reporting about AI valuations and revolutionary breakthroughs, and ask yourself whether specific companies being discussed actually have sustainable business models, have sustainable revenue streams, whether they're actually solving real life problems that need to be solved. Ask whether they're creating genuine value or just capturing a moment of irrational, speculative investment. So let's bring all of this together. We have Republican senators who used a government shutdown, the longest in American history, to insert provisions that personally enrich themselves. Section 213 is corruption dressed up as a legislative remedy that only they can seek. It's self dealing at its most brazen level. And while a bipartisan group of House members are trying to repeal it, it remains operative for now, and it remains a potential windfall for Republican senators today. And we have an AI bubble forming in some senses, but I think the nuance is missing from the conversation. It will eventually correct, yes, but many AI startups will fail because they lack defensible, sustainable business models and revenue streams. But the companies that provide the infrastructure, what is necessary, Nvidia, others, Cisco, well, they'll continue to thrive. These might seem like unrelated topics, but I think they're both about the same fundamental issue, which is distinguishing between genuine value and opportunistic exploitation. See, Section 213 exploits legislative power for personal gain. It's not about protecting senatorial privilege or clarifying statutory ambiguities. It's about Republican senators using their positions to extract money from the Treasury. And similarly, many AI startups are exploiting investor enthusiasm without actually creating genuine value. And this is the playbook we've seen time and time again. They're not building many, some are. They aren't building defensible businesses or sustainable revenue streams or solving real problems in sustainable ways. They're riding a wave of hype and hoping to exit before reality catches up. Some will benefit, but many will lose. In my view, Section 213 needs to be repealed. So I encourage you to contact representatives and senators, tell them that corruption is corruption regardless of which party is doing it, and tell them that legislatures should not be able to write themselves checks from the United States Treasury and effectively, again, in my view, steal from taxpayers. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, I would say be thoughtful about where you invest your time, energy, and effort, and money and attention. The AI revolution is very much real, but not every company claiming to be a part of it, not every company I think deserves your support. And if you're investing as an ordinary person, I would say think critically about what you're investing in. We need more skepticism, I think, in general. We need more accountability and less tolerance for self-dealing and for greed and for potentially gross misrepresentations. And that's it for today's episode. So thanks for listening once again. If you want to support the show and keep it commercial free, visit discoursepod.org and consider becoming a subscriber and donating a monthly contribution to the show. It helps us cover our fixed costs and it helps us produce the show for you. Until next time, stay informed, stay skeptical, and don't let anyone tell you that corruption is just politics as usual, because it's not. And we should reject it. Thanks very much. That's it for today's episode of Discourse. Thank you for tuning in and being part of the conversation. You can catch future episodes of Discourse wherever you get your podcasts. If you found this discussion insightful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others who value thoughtful analysis over the noise. You can also join the conversation by visiting discoursepod.org and following me on X and Blue Sky at Prof. Unger for more insights and updates. Until next time, keep thinking critically, stay curious, and engage with respect. We'll see you soon. Discourse is a commentary podcast for informational and educational purposes only. It does not constitute professional advice or legal advice. The opinions expressed are solely those of the host and any guests, and do not reflect the views of any employer, institution, or organization. This podcast is not journalism and does not adhere to journalistic principles. It offers analysis, opinion, and discussion on current events, but should not be relied upon as a news source. Listeners should consult qualified professionals for legal or otherwise expert advice specific to their situation. Thanks for listening.